So I think we'll just get started in with our speaker. This morning we have Bob Thomas, who is with the Lancaster-Lebanon SCORE Volunteers, and we appreciate him joining us today in Lebanon and being able to share with us. The focus for today is the nonprofits, engagement and retention. And I do have some notes, so I tried to send it out to most folks, and I do have extras. I will forward them afterwards as well. But Bob, we welcome you this morning. Thank you for coming out. And if you just want to kind of start, you can kind of give your intro, your background, however you choose, but welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. As Barb mentioned, I'm Bob Thomas. I'm a volunteer with SCORE. SCORE is a national organization and nonprofit that provides free consulting services to businesses and nonprofits. My own background, spent actually my entire career in the nonprofit sector. The first 33 years of it, I was in college and university administration, and the last 10 years of that, I was a vice president at Millersville University in Lancaster. And then I left Millersville to become president of Tabor Community Services. I don't think you've ever heard of it. Tabor is a nonprofit located in Lancaster. Mission is to help those who are struggling with housing and/or personal financial difficulties. A fairly large organization. When I was there, I retired 4 years ago. We had about 55 employees, about an annual operating budget of $5 million. Let me ask, I know I met with this group in October and talked about nonprofit boards best practices. How many of you were part of that presentation? 1, 2, 3. Some were, some were not. Okay. And I remember after that presentation, Mara said that you were interested in hearing more about how to get board members recruited and engaged. And I'm prepared to talk about that. What I've given you is sort of our notes from that include what I covered last October, and also some new information that focuses on recruiting and engaging board members. For those who were not here last October, I'm going to run through perhaps more quickly than I did in October, all of this information, and I will point along the way to its connection to engaging board members. And then we'll get to that last section, which provides more detail than I shared with you last fall. First of all, let me say today that what I'm sharing with you are considered to be best practices for nonprofit boards. And I will tell you that in my experience, it's pretty rare that a nonprofit board manages to meet all of these standards. So don't be discouraged to think, oh my gosh, we don't do this and we don't do that and so forth. My experience is that most nonprofits fall short of these ideal standards. Every board I was ever associated with did. But I wanted to share what are considered to be best practices because that gives you something to aim for and shoot for. Quick review then, the purpose and the role of nonprofit boards is that, as you know, they are sanctioned by the IRS as organizations with charitable, religious, educational, and so forth mission. And their primary purpose is to, as opposed to for-profit organizations, their primary purpose is to serve that mission. For-profit businesses are in the business of selling services and products for the purpose of generating profits for their owners. And as you know, the most tangible benefit for nonprofit boards or nonprofits are exemptions from federal, state, and local taxes, and the ability to raise money through tax-deductible charitable contributions. While for-profit businesses are governed by their owners In contrast, nonprofit boards, directors are unpaid volunteers, and they are, in effect, the trustees of the organization's mission and operations. And I want to emphasize that boards are the trustees, the caretakers of the mission and the operation. And in the eyes of the federal government, boards are really the ultimate authority for nonprofits. I know that a lot of nonprofits, in order to get started, have to create a board. And so, you round up people Sometimes I've worked with some nonprofits that I'll say, well, who's on your board? Well, my brother and my sister-in-law and this guy lives down the street. And I understand how that happens, because all that you're required to do is provide names. The IRS doesn't vet who you put on your board. And you have to fulfill that requirement to become a nonprofit. But as you can see, as I'm trying to emphasize, that the boards are the caretakers of the mission. And that's a big responsibility, and ultimately have more authority and responsibility for that than anyone, including paid staff. Now, more specifically, boards are responsible for establishing direction for the organizations, which means developing and approving strategic plans. That's certainly a board function. Mission, vision statements, any changes or alterations to that, the board should be involved in those decisions. Board hires staff and then delegates to them the responsibility for managing the organization. It's often said that arguably the most important function a nonprofit board serves is to hire the executive director. And not just to hire anybody, but to hire the right person, somebody who can really serve the organization well. And I've been through a nonprofit executive director search recently, and we took it very, very seriously, because we knew that the person we would select would have enormous impact on the organization for years to come if we got it right, and we seem to have. But that's a very, very important function. Ensuring the organization has the financial resources it needs. Now, sometimes people think, oh, well, gee, does that mean that if the organization is inadequately funded, then the board has to go out and find the money? Well, the board doesn't necessarily assume that responsibility by itself. Ideally, you have staff who are very involved in fundraising. But ultimately, the final, again, responsibility lies with the board to ensure one way or another that there are sufficient funds for the organization to fulfill its mission. Providing oversight of the functioning of the organization, in other words, ensuring compliance with applicable laws, ethical standards, financial policies are important, because that is an area that the government does take a look at via the 990s that nonprofits submit. Now, you already know a lot of this, not only because I talked about it last fall, but through your own experience, you already know a lot of this, and you're thinking probably, well, tell us something we don't know. But I do want to emphasize that at their best, a board really can provide a lot of value to the organization. They have the responsibility to do that. And when they are following best practices, they can add in a lot of different ways value to the organization. I know that oftentimes boards are seen as necessary evils. I can remember when I first went to Tabor and I talked with the management team there, and they would say, "Oh yeah, well, the board, we got to file this report with the board," and it was seen as we have to do these things, but they didn't necessarily see it as an opportunity to get anything for the organization out of those transactions. But again, at their best, when they're really realizing their potential, they can add a lot of value to the organization. Board composition, they talk in there about, again, ideally, Board members should be committed to the mission. You don't want people who don't really care about the mission for obvious reasons. They should be prepared to devote time, willing to make personal financial contributions to the best of their ability. This is important because if you're out trying to raise money, sometimes people will say, well, does your board support you? And if you can't say 100% of our board does, then people will wonder, well, you know, if the board doesn't support them, then why should I? It's not unusual for foundations to ask that question. So to the best of their ability, again, boards are not typically comprised of all wealthy people who can write big checks. Most of the time, that's not the case. But making a contribution to the best of their ability needs to be an expectation of all board members. Avoid conflicts of interest, refrain from micromanaging. This is an important sort of thing, particularly with organizations that haven't been in existence for long. It's not unusual for boards to get involved in running the operation. And that's understandable because there aren't staff to do all of those things. But as the organization develops and matures and so forth, you really want to keep the staff doing what its job is and try to keep the board from micromanaging the staff. That can be very discouraging to them. Collectively, a board with all of its members should have these areas of expertise, ideally leadership, some knowledge of the mission, particularly somebody who comes from the same field. You want to have somebody knowledgeable about finances, fundraising, of course, people who have community connections, and someone who is experienced with legal issues, ideally an attorney. That doesn't mean that person has to be the attorney for the organization. In many cases, they'll say, well, you know, what we're into here is not something I specialize in, but I know an attorney, this other person could be helpful to us. But they have the instincts to know when the matter at hand has legal ramifications. I say some things in here. I repeated them I said them last October. Not all board members are going to be rich, obviously, and generous and comfortable with asking other people for money. There is sort of this mythical, stereotypical board picture of, well, they're all rich people, you know, and they all have rich friends, and they can all write big checks. I happen to serve on a board right now. It's a nonprofit, but doesn't have a social service mission. And because we have had a few very generous donors, there is this idea that the board ought to be comprised of all rich people who know rich people, and they can call them up and say, you know, hey, Mary, hey, George, you know, this organization, I'm on the board, they need some money. Can you write us a check, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, you know? Well, in my experience, that happens, that's the exception rather than the rule. It just doesn't happen that way. One, there are a lot of people with resources, but, you know, they're not everywhere, and they're not on every street corner. And even if you get people with resources, that doesn't mean they're by nature generous. And oftentimes they are already on some other boards, and so they're committed to some other organization. So finding wealthy people who are really interested in your mission, who are generous and they're willing to support it, those are jewels, believe me, in my experience, but they are not typical of what you find on boards. That doesn't mean that the board members who are not rich and so forth can't contribute a lot. They can, but again, it's a myth to say, well, you know, the board must have all these rich people. Most of the time, we do not. But there are ways in which board members can support development activities, and I've listed them there, introducing people to the organization. When I was at Tabor, Ann Shannon, maybe you know, she's on WGAL all the time. She was a board member. And when she joined the board, she said, I remember very well, she said, Bob, I love your organization, I love your mission, but please don't ask me to ask somebody else for money. I hate doing that. I can't do it. And I said, that's okay, you can help us in other ways. And she did, brought a lot of visibility to the community. But one time, I'll never forget this, she said, oh, by the way, would you like to meet Ann Varshager? Now, Ann Varshager is a name that maybe some of you have heard of, very, very wealthy, very generous philanthropist based in Lancaster. There are buildings and programs all over Lancaster County named for her because she was very generous to them. And I said, well, sure, I would love to meet Ann Varshager. And she said, well, I've gotten acquainted with her because we've covered some things that she's done. And I'd be willing to set up a lunch so you can meet her. And I said, tell me when and where, and I'll be there. Well, that began the start of a couple of years of cultivating Ann. She was interested in us, but she wasn't one to, open up her wallet just on the spot. You had to get to know her. She had to get to know you. There was a lot of cultivation involved. But 2 years later, she ended up making a very large 6-figure gift to Tabor. We named a program in her honor. And this was all the result of a board member who said, don't ever ask me to ask somebody for money. She bowed out of the lunches right early on. She didn't want to be involved in asking, but she performed an enormously important and valuable service by introducing us to this person. Board members can write little notes on thank you letters and all those other things that can help. Now, let's get to what you were really interested in here. Fifth page, recruiting and engaging strong boards. And in bold and italicized is that sentence. You can read it, but let me talk a little bit about it. Successfully engaging a board in your work begins with recruiting the right people and recruiting them in the right way so they fully understand what your mission is and what their role would be, and orienting them to all of that information. Sometimes I'll hear from people say, well, our board doesn't seem to be really that engaged. That's not an uncommon kind of refrain from nonprofits. They don't do that much for us. That's sometimes why people view them as a necessary evil. But when I begin to ask, well, tell me about them. How long have they been on the board? Why did you ask them to be on the board in particular to begin with? How have they been oriented to what their role is and who you are? Tell me about your meetings. Oftentimes, the answers to the lack of engagement are found in, well, they didn't really get the right people, or they got some people who are really not going to be very valuable or important and helpful to them. The people on the board don't really understand what their role is. Some of them think that it's their job to come in and micromanage, they take charge, hands on people, and that's what they want to do. Some of them don't really understand the organization all that well because they haven't been fully briefed on it. So it really begins, again, with recruiting the right people and then taking the time to fully brief them and educate them on who you are as an organization, on their role, the board's role, their responsibilities. And we'll get to, how you can, once you've done all that, how you can get them more engaged. But it starts early on in the process. It's not just a matter of, well, I've got this board and they don't seem to be engaged. And so what kind of tricks can I perform to get them really involved? That's much more difficult if you haven't laid the groundwork to begin with. Now, recruiting. Consider personal characteristics of prospects. They should be committed to your mission. They have to have the ability to think clearly, work with others, willing to spend some time in your behalf. Are you looking at prospective board members who have those qualities? Or are you saying, well, we need some more board members and we're just trying to come up with some names and we'll ask them because they may not have those kinds of personal characteristics. Some red flags to avoid. There are people who like to sort of enhance their reputation or pad their resume by saying, oh, I'm on this board and I'm on that board. You've maybe encountered some of those. I can remember when I was at Tabor, we'd be always sort of on the lookout for prospective board members. But if somebody says, oh, yes, well, I'm on this board and I'm on that board and I'm a big deal. And yeah, I could probably fit you into my schedule. And you would want me, of course, because I'm a big deal. I'm on all these other boards. And what they're real interested in was enhancing their reputation. You don't want people for whom that's all that important. Or maybe you have somebody who has a personal agenda. In this day and age with, I don't know how to describe the sort of controversies we seem to have. If you are an organization, for example, that is serving people who don't have much, who are struggling to make ends meet and so forth, you don't want people on the board who say, well, I want to get on that board because we're going to whip those people into shape. We're going to show them how to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And, you know, I gather you've encountered some people like that. Unless you believe that that is really an effective way to help people who are struggling, then you want to be careful about getting them on your boards because there will be tension between what you're trying to do and what they think should be done. People with an autocratic style, you want people on your board who can work with other people. You don't want people who come on and they're used to perhaps in, say, their own business being, my way or the highway, and then they want to sort of extend that to you too. Now, that doesn't work. After avoiding those kinds of things, develop a profile that needs your board has, and referring back to earlier in this handout about the kinds of skills and expertise ideally you would have within the board. Now, no one board member has all those, but you can have an attorney, you can have somebody who has connections in the community, you can have somebody who is really attuned to your mission and knowledgeable about it. So evaluate, all right, take a look. Well, as we look at our board, we have, some of these covered, but some we don't. So that can bring some focus to your recruiting. We'd love to get somebody who knows something about marketing, communications, as an example. What needs will you have in the next 3 years? Too, think about that. Well, we think we might want to have a campaign to do such and such in the next 3 years. Well, okay, then do you have people on your board who could help provide leadership for a campaign? So you want to get focused on what your needs. I'm not a believer in planning 3 years or beyond 3 years personally. I'm always an advocate for 3-year strategic plans, and too much can change over 5 years, let alone 10 and 15. Then you begin to identify prospects, and you got to cast a wide net. I would suggest, and others would be helpful to you, and think about, well, okay, let's contact staff. Maybe they know some people. Maybe we have some volunteers who know some people. Maybe within the ranks of those who are already supportive of the organization, they would know some people. Cast a wide net and ask others for suggestions of names. I've been in those meetings where we say, well, we want to get some more board members, and there's 3 people there. And, well, okay, who can I think of? You've got to cast a wider net than that. You've got to get more people involved to get people thinking about what their needs are, and maybe somebody who they know. People responsible for board recruiting say, all right, everybody needs to turn out and get your contact list. Who's running the contact list? Sometimes when you do things like that, you go, oh, I never thought of her. It should be really good. I'm glad I looked at my contact list. it'll trigger some ideas. Sometimes family members can help. I happen to be chair of a nonprofit board right now, and we were looking at as always, board members. And I even had a little group and we started having brainstorm. And my wife said, I was telling her about what we're doing. My wife said, have you ever thought about Karen? Karen lives up the street, but I also have she's a professional colleague. And I said, oh gosh, no, I hadn't thought of her. How did I never think of her? My wife was the source. Well, I approached Karen. Karen is now on our board, and she's proving to be an excellent board member. And I thank my wife for coming up with her. I couldn't think of her. So get a lot of people involved. Once you have a list of prospects, you've got to cultivate them and involve your CEO, your executive director, whatever that person's title may be. Share information about the organization. I sat down with Karen and I went through all kinds of information about who we were and who we are and what we do and the board's role, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We spent an hour and a half in a coffee shop and she asked a lot of good questions. You can invite them if you have events. That's a way for them to see firsthand, get a sense of who you are, what you do, and so forth. If you have committees, you can invite people to join your committee as a precursor to becoming a board member. If you have some event that you need some more people, well, would you consider joining this committee and helping us plan this event, for example? Then that can get them more engaged, more involved, and ultimately lead to their being interested. Now, when you get around to inviting these people that you have vetted and so forth, you want to share a lot of information with them about what their role is. You don't want people getting on the board and saying, well, nobody ever told me that I had to do this. You don't want that to happen. You want them to fully understand in advance what their role is and what their responsibilities are. Because if you, coming back to this issue of engagement, if you have people joining your board who are missing some important pieces of information, they're not going to be very good prospects to get engaged. They're more likely to say, oh, well, I wish you had told me this in advance. I didn't know that. You don't want that to happen. You can share meeting schedules, possible committee assignments. Yeah, once they've said, okay, yeah, I agree, you think they're going to be good prospects, I agree to join the board, they get elected, the board should be doing that. Then you need to orient them. Orientation ought to be an expectation, it's not an option. It's not something that you do on the fly for 15 minutes. You want to have, we schedule one board I'm on, we schedule about an hour and a half to 2 hour orientation with each new board member, sharing with them a lot of information, some of which you've told them about, but some of which would be new. It's helpful if you have people to do it, to prepare a handbook for them, that it contains all these things, all these bulleted points here. Contact information for all the board members. That's nice to know because board members will be interested in who else is on the board. And if I want to contact them, I know how to. In writing their responsibilities, ideally, I've been a part of organizations where you have a job description and there's a signature line at the bottom. You go over it with them very carefully and ask them to sign it. So they're reinforcing the idea that they've got some responsibilities. Make a copy of it for them to keep. You want to give them bylaws and committee structure and so forth. The mission and vision statements. So if they're going to be involved in strategic planning, that's where that begins. An organizational chart, part of our orientation in this one organization is to fully brief the organization, or pardon me, the board members on all of what we do. We have multiple programs and they need to understand all of that. And they need to have some familiarity with the range of the things that you do. A lot of times people will say, oh, I didn't know you did that. 2. That's news. And they're not disappointed or upset, but they're like, oh, gee, okay, thanks. I didn't really understand that. It's easy for board members to feel overwhelmed if you have an organization that provides a variety of services and they're not really very well briefed on that range. When I was at Tabor, we had at our height 23 different programs, named programs and services in both housing and financial counseling. We had that many because there were different funding sources for different kinds of things that we could do. Now, we tried to integrate them as much as possible and so forth, but we had an organizational chart that looked a little bit like the Pentagon. I used to laugh, but there was a lot of programs. And board members, even after an orientation, even after they've been on the board for a year, they'd say, it took me a year or so to really get my mind wrapped around all the stuff we do. Now, not all organizations are that complex, but don't assume that, they understand all of what we do as well as I do. No, they probably won't. Certainly, you want to cover the strategic plan, financial information. When I was at Tabor, finances were complicated. Even our auditors thought we were complicated because we had 23 programs and we had probably 40 different sources of revenue and support for them. And keeping all that straight took me a while, and I was the president to get my mind wrapped around all that. Fortunately, we had a chief financial officer who was great at all that, but it was overwhelming to board members. Even after a year, they said, even as I said, even our auditors said, boy, you're complicated. We had to change our auditors after I'd been there for a few years, and so we shopped around and we picked one. And then after they really got involved through the first audit, they said, "Oh, you're really complicated. We thought because you're smaller than some of the businesses and organizations we audited wouldn't be that difficult. But wow, you got a lot of stuff going on here, and money coming in from all directions, conditions on how you could use this money versus this pot of money, and so forth." So. But you got to spend some time with board members helping them kind of get the basics at least. What are the sources of revenue? What are the sources of expenditures? A balance sheet, that sort of thing. Make your financial reports to the board as understandable as possible. It's easy to overwhelm them with financial statements. Their eyes glaze over. I was at a meeting just very, very recently. I'm trying to remember what it was. And they were passing out those spreadsheets and multiple pages. And everybody, I could see everybody was like, their eyes are glazing over. It's helpful when presenting financial information to a board and they can get more involved. Create a dashboard, if you're familiar with that term. Think of, well, what are the most important 5 or 6 most important financial indicators of how we're doing? Revenue or expenses, or pick only 5 or 6. You might be able to provide, 10 times that, but you don't want to overwhelm them. What are the 5 or 6 things that we need to keep our eye on? I happen to be chair of a board for a nonprofit counseling agency. We have a dashboard. One of the first things is number of counseling sessions per month. So we meet every month and we get that. That's one of the first things. That's a big indicator of how we're doing and revenue and so forth. Board policies, they should have copies of things like conflict of interest. They will likely want to know, well, am I covered with your liability insurance? I don't want to get sued by being on your board. You need to assure them that you've got them covered under your insurance policy. A list of staff, the meeting schedule. You don't want to give them the meeting schedule well in advance. You don't want to tell them at the end of each meeting, well, our next meeting is next month at such and such a time, especially if they're a little irregular. they say, well, I've got a conflict that night, or whatever. Had I known in advance, I would have blocked that time out. So give them, if you can, a meeting schedule a year in advance. All right, finally, to the issue of getting them engaged. You've recruited the right people, you've oriented them, introduced them to everything, and made sure they understand all this stuff. Engaging, we'll keep them focused on the board's roles, going back to that section A and B. Keep them focused in meetings on, back now on page 15. What am I referring to? Actually, yeah, I'm sorry. Back to the role of the boards, right back at the beginning. Keep them focused on the direction of the organization, strategic directions. Sometimes boards will approve strategic plans and then they put them away. Staff puts them away and they end up on a shelf or in a file drawer somewhere. One of the things I found helpful with one organization where I'm the chair, we have the key strategic initiatives for the next at least a year at a time. And I put them on every agenda. At the board meeting, every agenda, and we say every time, okay, what's the update on this or that? Now, we always say, you don't have to have an update every meeting, but that's a way of keeping them reminded of what those initiatives are. And that if you haven't had an update in 2 or 3 months, then maybe it's time to say, well, what's happening with this particular initiative or that particular initiative? Keep it on the agenda so that they're regularly reminded. And then talk about those strategic issues. That keeps them focused where they need to be rather than getting into the nitty-gritty. And boards, the best of intentions will, we, in that same organization, I think it was the treasurer mentioned that this one program was having trouble invoicing. Part of its revenue is invoicing recipients of the services, and they were having trouble doing that. And so naturally somebody wanted, well, what's the problem? Pretty soon, 5 minutes, we had a discussion where everybody had ideas on how to invoice the recipients of the service. And I finally said, we're micromanaging people. Let's stop. We have people responsible for getting this problem resolved. Let's ask them to do that and report back at the next board or 2 board meetings on their progress in doing that. But even the best of intentioned boards have kind of like, they can't resist the temptation. Ask for discussion, encourage questions and answers. I will say, all right, I want to hear from every board member on this question. I don't do that all the time, but for a big question, everybody should weigh in on this. I want to hear from everybody. And I literally will look around the table and, everybody will come up with something anyway. But that's a way to not only say, please talk about this, but you've got to, we're counting on you to do that. Ask board members what issues interest them the most. And then that can help you too in getting them engaged with one thing or another that they're interested in. That's a natural reinforcer for people to be doing something that they're interested in. Assign, again, follow-up tasks, ask for reports at board meetings, keep them, on task. Things get done that way and they're more engaged. And then finally, a suggestion, communicate between meetings. Sometimes maybe you have a board meeting and the next month, nobody can remember what you talked about at the last one. So I ask our executive director, meet monthly. So about 2 weeks later, send out an email with a few highlights about something we discussed. an update, new development, whatever. Doesn't matter, but communicate in between meetings, because then, you know, via email, but that there's a reminder to them, oh yeah, okay, that keeps them sort of on topic. Now, finally, again, these are best practices. I want to emphasize, rarely does a board do all of these things. But they are, I think, direction gives direction for what you should be aiming for, what you should be shooting for. If you're really interested in this topic, here's a couple of references, a couple of books that you can get. The first one is a very practical kind of guide. The second one, if you're really interested, Governance is Leadership. One of the best things I've ever read about the role of nonprofit boards. It's pretty conceptual, fairly high level stuff, but it's one of the best, most insightful things I've ever read about nonprofit boards. Okay, what questions do you have, comments? So well, this is all nice, but let me tell you what I got 4 people on my board. You know, how do we do all these things?
I know, I'd just like to make a comment. I'm on a board and, you know, the commitment level is, you know, as a member, you're always like, okay, I got to make sure I have that time. And occasionally they'll send out a retreat option to do. And I think, oh, darn, another thing. But when I give myself that opportunity to go and engage with that, it's usually less informal. And it's an opportunity to engage with my other board members that sometimes during the board meeting, I don't get the opportunity to. And I find it very helpful. So while I'm initially like, oh, I can't believe they want to do something else. But it truly, truly does, I think from my perspective, help me on different levels. So while I know initially they may think, just like I do, yeah. I find it very, very helpful, or I learn something additional. And I think that's the hardest for me as a board member, understanding that, because you have that peripheral view all the time. And just getting to know a little bit more can, I think, help make you more effective. But anyway, that's just kind of a comment, but I don't know, retreats and those kinds of things and, you know, kind of making them work. I'm sure everybody has their own, you know, magic number of those. So I just wanted to share that, my experience.
I agree. Retreats can, if well designed, can be very, very helpful. In engaging people and coming up with ideas, et cetera, et cetera. I am always sort of mindful of the fact that board members are volunteers and you need to treat their time respectfully. Don't take it for granted. I'm one who really likes to conduct meetings, kind of be very organized and get to things and move things along. I don't like, unless it's a very important issue and we feel like people really need to weigh in on it, I don't like to have discussions sort of drift, and particularly if they end inconclusively, like, oh, no. I like to keep people on task. That's just my nature, but it also, I'm trying to be respectful of their time. We meet monthly, Monday nights at 7 o'clock, and prior to the time I served chair, meetings typically lasted 2, sometimes 2.5 hours. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but 2.5 hours on a Monday night after a full day, I'm like, you know, let me out of here. And so I very deliberately reorganize the meetings and keep them moving. And we haven't had a meeting go past about 90 minutes in the past year. And I've had several board members say, good for you, Bob. I like you as the chair. Will you stay as chair forever? Because I like your meetings. So you got to be respectful of people's time. If you ask them to devote a half a day or a day, There ought to be a really clear purpose. There ought to be a carefully prepared agenda. You ought to have other board members involved in putting together the agenda who will speak to and in behalf of devoting the time for the agenda. Because if they hear from other board members, that makes them a little more perhaps inclined to say, okay, you know, I'll do it.
Anybody else virtually? Do we have any questions from anyone virtually? They have no faces.
They all went to sleep.
Anybody else in the room? We definitely want to thank you for coming here and sharing with us. We really do appreciate that. I'm going to hit.
I put my contact information there at the bottom. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy you ever want to talk about your board situation. But the final thought, again, to emphasize, these are ideals that you aim for. Don't be discouraged if you're not there. If you want to talk about where you are as an organization, where your board is, and how you can, what should be the next step, let me know. I'll be happy to talk.